He defended Apache Chief. Next day, 3 giant and curvy Apache women came to my house as Chief's gift. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The year was 1882, Arizona Territory, and the trading post at Dry Fork was the kind of place where men came to get what they needed and leave quick. It sat at the crossing of 2 wagon roads, a few weathered buildings huddled together in the dust, with a saloon at the center that stayed noisy from dawn till night. Levi Boone tied his horse at the rail and stepped down slowly, his boots hitting the dirt with the heaviness of someone who moved because he had to, not because he wanted to. At 39, he was tall, his shoulders still broad from years of work, but there was a weariness to him, a way he kept his jaw tight and his eyes watchful, like he expected trouble even when there wasn't any. He wore a simple work shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and a revolver sat at his hip in a scuffed holster that looked used but cared for. Levi lived alone on a small ranch nearly half a day's ride south, a patch of land with a narrow creek, a cabin he built with his own hands, and enough horses to keep him busy. He wasn't a farmer, never planted more than a few beans and corn by the cabin, and he wasn't a soldier, though he had the look of a man who had seen things he didn't speak of. He stayed alive by trading livestock and by keeping to himself. People in town respected that, even if they whispered about his past. Inside the mercantile, Levi spoke few words as he ordered coffee, salt, and flour. The clerk didn't press him with small talk. Men like Boone didn't waste time with chatter. He was halfway out the door with his supplies when noise broke out across the street. 2 men were laughing loud outside the saloon, drunk before noon. One of them, a thick-set settler with a red face and sweat-stained hat, stumbled into the path of an old Apache man. The elder carried a carved staff and walked slow, his hair long and streaked with gray. His features were cut deep by years of weather and hardship. He had probably come into town to trade for basic goods, maybe a little flour or tobacco, though most settlers looked at men like him as if they didn't belong. Levi stopped near the mercantile door, his sack of flour balanced in his arms. He felt his jaw tighten when the drunk planted himself in front of the elder. "Don't belong here," the settler slurred, shoving the Apache hard in the chest. The old man staggered but didn't raise his hands. His eyes stayed calm, though his knuckles whitened against his staff. A few townsfolk stood watching. A woman leading a child looked away quickly. A man at the blacksmith shop pretended not to see. Nobody stepped forward. Levi's stomach turned cold, the kind of feeling he knew too well. He didn't like stepping into trouble. He'd built his whole life around avoiding it. But something about the old man's stillness, the way he bore the shove without anger or fear, cut at him. He thought of his own father, long gone now, and how a man's dignity could be stripped in a moment if no one stood up. The drunk drew back his arm as if to strike. Levi's body moved before his mind caught up. He set the flour down in the dirt, hands sliding to the revolver at his hip. His boots pressed firm into the ground as he stepped forward. "Back away," Levi said, his voice low and steady. The street went quiet. Even the horses tied at the rail seemed to pause. The settler squinted at him, blinking through drink. "Ain't your business, Boone." Levi's revolver cleared the holster halfway, the sun flashing along the steel. His eyes locked on the man's, calm but unshaking. He wasn't looking for blood, but he wasn't going to let this go. Inside, Levi felt the tightness in his chest, that mix of fear and resolve that came every time he stood between someone weak and someone cruel. He hated the feeling, his heart thudding, palms itching, but he hated doing nothing more. "I said back away," Levi repeated. The drunk hesitated, looking at the steady way Boone held the revolver. He muttered something under his breath, spat into the dirt, and staggered back toward the saloon. His friend followed, glancing nervously at Levi's gun. The crowd began to move again, murmurs running low. No one said thank you. No one said anything. That was the way of these places. Men minded their own business, even when their business should have been a step in. Levi holstered the revolver and bent to pick up his sack. His hands felt tight on the canvas, but his face showed nothing. He turned to the Apache elder, who was watching him with those calm, dark eyes. The old man didn't speak. He lifted his hand slowly to his chest, pressed his palm there in a gesture of thanks, and gave a small nod. Levi felt the weight of it. He wasn't a man who liked gratitude. It made him feel seen, and being seen usually led to trouble. But he nodded back once, silent, and turned away. He loaded his horse, mounted up, and rode out of town, the sun beating down on his hat brim. His heart was still beating faster than he wanted, and he hated that the drunk's words stuck in his head. "Ain't your business, Spoon." He told himself he'd forget it by the time he reached his ranch, told himself it was nothing. But deep down he knew he had changed something by stepping in, and he had no idea that by the next morning, his solitude would end at the knock of fate. The next morning broke dry and still across Levi Boone's land, the kind of silence that always greeted him before the sun climbed high enough to burn the horizon. His ranch wasn't much. One cabin built from pine hauled years back, a small corral, a half-rotted barn leaning against the wind, and open desert stretching farther than a man could ride in a day. It was quiet, and quiet was all he ever asked for. He had never married, never kept a family, and after years of working cattle trails and wandering with no real place, he had settled here on the edge of nowhere. It was enough to wake each morning to his horse's breathing and the sound of wind over sand. He thought little of what had happened to the trading post the day before. He had told himself the Apache elder had likely gone back to his own people, maybe carrying a sack of cornmeal or tobacco, maybe not carrying anything at all. Levi didn't believe in owing or being owed. He had stepped in because a man shouldn't be struck down while the whole street stood and watched. That was all. He poured coffee into a tin cup, stood in his doorway, and looked over the land while the sun rose sharp over the ridges. It was mid-morning when the horses in his corral started to shift restless, ears twitching toward the road. Levi narrowed his eyes and set down the cup. Dust trailed in the distance, not the thin line of one rider, but the heavier swirl of more. His hand touched the revolver at his hip out of habit, but he didn't move for it. He waited. 3 figures approached on foot, tall and unhurried. At first glance, he thought they were men from a distance, their height and posture carrying strength uncommon in most women. But as they came closer, the truth was plain. They were women, Apache, each carrying a small bundle of belongings tied in cloth, their faces calm but not uncertain. Levi's chest tightened. He didn't like visitors, and Apache women standing at the edge of his yard was the last thing he expected. He stepped down off the porch, boots sinking into the dust, and waited as they drew near. The one in front stopped first. She was striking, bronze skin, black hair falling loose over her shoulders, a deerskin dress decorated with beads and feathers. The fabric was torn at the neckline and sides, showing the strain of travel and the curve of her chest where the seam had split. She was tall, taller than most men Levi had known, her figure commanding without her saying a word. Her eyes were dark and sharp, watching him with the kind of strength that didn't flinch. The second stood a step behind, slimmer, her hair braided and tied with leather. Her dress hung modest with shells sewn into the hem. She kept her gaze lowered, but her movements were careful, every step thought out. She looked younger than the first, but older than the last, and there was a gentleness in her posture. The third, the youngest, stood slightly apart. She was taller than both the others, her shoulders broad, her arms marked with bracelets of stone beads. She carried herself with restless energy, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, as if ready for a fight if one came. Her eyes stayed on Levi's revolver more than his face, distrust plain. The eldest woman spoke first, her English accented but clear. "The chief you stood for," she said, her voice steady. "He is our elder. He sent us to you." Levi frowned. His first thought was that he had no use for gifts, no interest in arrangements he hadn't asked for. His life was built on silence, not company, and the idea of 3 strangers arriving on his land with the expectation of staying made his throat tighten. "I didn't do it for trade," he said after a long pause. His voice was even, but inside his chest there was unease. "I don't need nothing." The woman didn't move. Her gaze stayed locked on him. "We were sent. We came." She turned slightly, gesturing to the others. "We cannot return." Levi looked from one face to the next. He didn't know what drove them here besides the chief's decision, whether it was custom, gratitude, or a way of binding peace. He only knew they were standing on his land with no horses, no way back, and no fear in their eyes. The youngest one gripped her bundle tighter, as if daring him to send them off. The silence stretched, heavy. Levi felt the weight of decision pressing on him, the same way it had in town when the drunk raised his hand. He thought of how folks would see this if they rode by. 3 Apache women living under his roof, and how the talk would spread in whispers and laughter. He thought of the empty rooms in his cabin, the empty nights by the fire, and the years of waking up with no one to speak to. His heart beat slow, but hard. He wasn't afraid of them, but he was afraid of what they meant. Company was noise. Company was responsibility. Company meant remembering what it was to care about someone again. Still, he couldn't turn them away. He wasn't built for that. No matter how much he told himself he lived without needing others. "You can come inside," he said finally, his voice quiet. The eldest woman nodded once, sharp and certain, as though she had known what his answer would be all along. They stepped past him, their shadows stretching long across the dirt, and entered the cabin. Levi stood for a moment, breathing against the weight in his chest. He didn't like how fast his thoughts were moving. Didn't like the pull he felt when his eyes had caught the curve of the eldest's torn dress or the guarded pride in her face. He told himself it was just trouble dressed different, but he couldn't deny the silence of his cabin was already broken. Inside, the scrape of chairs and the shuffle of feet marked the beginning of something he hadn't planned for. Levi Boone had lived alone for too long, and now 3 women had crossed his door like it was nothing. And he knew, without a doubt, nothing about his life would be the same. The cabin wasn't built for company. Its walls were plain pine, chinked with mud, and the windows were small squares that barely let in the morning light. A narrow table sat in the middle, with 2 mismatched chairs pushed tight against it. The stove sat in the corner, black iron with a pipe leading up through the roof. Levi's bed, a simple frame with a straw-stuffed mattress, filled most of the far wall, leaving little space beyond a wooden trunk and a shelf holding a few tin plates, cups, and an old Bible left by whoever had owned the land before him. When the women stepped inside, the air seemed to shift. They brought with them the smell of dust, leather, and smoke, a reminder that they had walked many miles before reaching his door. Levi lingered by the threshold for a moment, adjusting to the sight of 3 figures filling a room he had always moved through alone. Asha, the eldest, set her bundle on the table with calm precision, her dark eyes sweeping the room as if taking its measure. Tallulah lingered by the stove, fingers brushing over its iron surface, testing the warmth of a place that looked livable but bare. Mika stayed closest to the door, her back nearly brushing against Levi's arm, her stance rigid, her eyes sharp on the revolver at his hip as though daring him to make one wrong move. Levi cleared his throat. His voice came rough from disuse. "Ain't much here. You'll make do." It was an invitation, not really, but it was all he could offer. He stepped past Mika, careful not to brush her shoulder, and set the sack of flour on the table beside Asha's bundle. His movements were deliberate, slow, as if to show he meant no sudden harm. For a long while, no one spoke. The only sound was the shifting of boots on the wooden floor and the faint creak of the roof in the wind. Levi busied himself with the stove, striking a match and setting it to the kindling until the fire caught. He hated the silence, not because it was uncomfortable for him. He had lived with silence for years, but because now it wasn't the right kind of silence. It wasn't the peace of solitude. It was something heavier awaiting. Tallulah was the first to break it. Her voice was quiet, her English careful. "We can cook." She gestured toward the stove, her tone not asking permission so much as offering to make themselves useful. Levi gave a short nod. "There's beans in the sack by the door. Coffee, too." He hesitated before adding, "Ain't much else till I head back to town." Tallulah moved softly across the room, her steps light, her braids swaying against her back as she fetched the beans. Mika followed her with her eyes the whole way, ready to jump if anything seemed off. Asha, meanwhile, sat in one of the chairs without asking, her posture tall, her torn dress pulling slightly at the seam across her chest. She didn't fidget, didn't shift, she simply sat like she belonged. Levi felt his gaze slip toward her before he caught himself and looked away. He busied his hands with stacking a few sticks by the stove. Inside, his thoughts churned. He wasn't prepared for this. He had no plan for where they'd sleep or how long they'd stay. He knew the townsfolk would talk, already suspicious of him, and now they'd have reason. He thought of the words the drunk had spat at him. Ain't your business, Spoon. Maybe he had made it his business when it shouldn't have been. Still, when he glanced at Asha, her eyes steady on him, he felt the pull of something he couldn't name. She wasn't looking at him with fear or expectation, just measuring him the same way he measured her. The beans went into the pot, water ladled from the bucket outside. The room warmed with the smell of cooking, and the tension eased slightly, though Mika never sat. She stood near the door like a guard, her arms crossed tight. Levi finally spoke again. You could take the bed. His voice was flat, but his jaw tightened as he said it. I'll sleep by the fire. Asha's eyes narrowed slightly, as if testing whether this was a trick. Tallulah nodded once, grateful but silent. Mika only scowled, her lips pressed tight. Levi ignored it. He had spent years with no one beside him. One more night on a blanket by the fire wasn't going to kill him. When the beans were ready, Tallulah set them on the table. The women took small portions, eating slowly. Levi sat last, his spoon scraping against the tin bowl in the same rhythm he had kept every evening alone. The difference was that now the sound wasn't swallowed by empty walls. It was joined by the soft scrape of three others. He didn't realize until that moment how much he had grown used to the sound of eating alone. After the meal, Asha rose, her height commanding even in the cramped space. She carried her empty bowl to the shelf and set it down carefully, then turned toward him. Her eyes held his for a long moment. There was no smile, no thanks spoken, but something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the ground they had entered together. The night stretched long after that. Levi lay on his blanket by the fire, his revolver within reach, though he told himself it was only habit. He listened to the small sounds he had never known in his cabin before. The rustle of fabric as the women settled on the bed. The low whisper of Tallulah saying something soft in her own language. The creak of wood under Mika's shifting weight as she stayed half awake, guarding even in rest. Levi stared at the ceiling beams, his thoughts restless. He wondered what the chief had meant by sending them, whether this was a gift or a burden or something else entirely. He wondered what the women thought of him, whether they feared him, despised him, or weighed him the way Asha's sharp eyes seemed to do. And beneath it all, a quieter thought stirred, one he didn't want to admit. He didn't mind the company, not as much as he thought he would. The silence of the cabin had changed, and though it unsettled him, it didn't feel wrong. By the time the fire burned low and the desert wind pushed faintly through the cracks in the walls, Levi Boone knew sleep wouldn't come easy. Not with three strangers in his bed and the memory of Asha's steady gaze still pressing at him from the dark. The next morning, the sun came early through the cracks of the cabin, strips of light cutting across the floorboards. Levi had slept little, his back stiff from the blanket by the fire, his ears alert to every small sound through the night. He rose before the women, moving quiet, pouring water from the bucket into a basin and splashing his face to shake off the heaviness in his head. When he turned, Asha was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. She didn't speak, only watched him with the same steady eyes that had unsettled him the day before. He set the basin aside and pulled on his boots. Got chores, he muttered, more to himself than to her, and stepped outside. The ranch waited the way it always did. Horses restless in the corral, the barn leaning under its own age, fences sagging where rails had fallen loose. But now there were more hands than his. By mid-morning, all three women had stepped into the rhythm without being asked. Tallulah moved to the stove, gathering wood from the pile outside and setting a pot of water to boil. She hummed under her breath as she worked, the tune soft and steady, filling the air with something the cabin had never carried before. Mika, strong and quick, followed Levi to the corral. She carried fence posts one by one, her tall frame making light of work that usually left Levi's shoulders aching. She said little, but the sharp suspicion in her eyes seemed to soften each time he let her work beside him without interference. Asha, meanwhile, stayed close to Levi, handing him nails, steadying rails as he hammered them into place. She didn't speak often, but her presence pressed against him like heat. Every brush of her arm, every glance that lingered, carried weight he tried not to notice. By noon, sweat clung to them all. Levi stopped at the well, drawing up a bucket of water and setting it down hard on the worn wood. He drank first, then stepped back. Asha bent next, lifting the ladle with slow grace. When the water spilled down her chin and onto her torn dress, the fabric clung to her chest, showing more of her curves than she likely intended. Levi looked away, jaw tightening, forcing himself to study the horizon instead. But when she caught him stealing a glance, her lips curved the faintest bit. Not a smile, not quite, but an acknowledgement that she had noticed. Inside, Levi felt the stir of something he had long buried. It wasn't just want. It was the pull of company after too many years of silence. He hated the weakness of it, hated that his eyes betrayed him, but he couldn't deny the heat that pressed through his chest. They ate beans and flatbread for their midday meal, sitting around the table together for the first time. Levi had never shared that table with anyone since building it. The sound of spoons against bowls, the low murmur of Tallulah speaking something to Mika in their own tongue, the scrape of Asha's chair as she shifted, it all filled the cabin in a way that unsettled him and steadied him at the same time. That afternoon, Levi saddled his horse. "Need to head into town," he said. His supplies were low, and he wanted more coffee, more flour, and maybe salt pork if he could get it. But as soon as the words left his mouth, the air in the room changed. Mika stood quick, eyes flashing. "We go too," she said, her English blunt but certain. Levi shook his head. "Ain't wise. Folks talk enough as it is." But Asha rose, her height matching his, her gaze unflinching. "We are not hidden," she said. "We walk." Levi's jaw clenched. He imagined the looks, the whispers. He imagined the drunk from the day before, or worse, men who might think 3 women under his roof meant they were his to trade. But looking at Asha's face, calm, certain, he knew he couldn't lock them inside like cattle. "Fine," he said, his voice low. "Stay close." The ride into town was slow. Tallulah walked beside the horse with Mika, while Asha rode behind Levi, her arms light around his waist, her breath steady against his back. He kept his eyes fixed on the road, his body tense, every nerve aware of her closeness. When they reached the trading post, the effect was immediate. Men turned. Women drew their children closer. The blacksmith paused mid-swing, hammer hanging in the air. Levi felt the weight of every stare. He tied his horse at the rail, shoulders stiff, and led the women toward the mercantile. Inside, the clerk's eyes flicked from him to Asha, then down to the torn fabric of her dress. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again. Levi ordered supplies in his usual clipped tone. Flour, coffee, salt pork, nails. The clerk nodded quickly, hurrying to fetch the goods. Behind Levi, Mika stood with her arms crossed, her glare daring anyone to comment. Tallulah stayed close to her, quiet, while Asha stood tall, her presence so commanding that no one dared speak. When the supplies were loaded, Levi paid and led the way out. But on the porch, a ranch hand, lounging with a bottle in hand, muttered just loud enough. "Boone's got himself a house full." Laughter followed. Another voice added, "But he don't sleep alone no more." Levi stopped dead. His hand twitched toward his revolver, but he forced it still. The women stood behind him, silent, waiting. He turned his head, his voice flat as steel. "Say another word." The laughter died quick. The ranch hands shifted, muttered, and went back to their bottle. Levi walked on, his chest tight with heat. He didn't look back until they were clear of the town. On the ride home, no one spoke. But when they reached the cabin, Asha touched his arm before stepping inside. Just a touch, nothing more, but it was the first gesture that wasn't guarded. Levi felt it long after she let go. That night, when he lay again on the blanket by the fire, the cabin was different. The air carried not only the sound of their breathing, but the weight of choices already made. Levi Boone had defended the chief without thought. Now, 3 women lived under his roof, his name whispered in town with laughter and suspicion. And though he told himself he had only done what was right, part of him already knew his life was no longer his alone. The week after their first trip into town weighed heavy on Levi Boone. The whispers he heard on the mercantile porch hadn't faded from his mind. Every time he saddled his horse or hammered a rail into place, he could still hear the laughter. Boone don't sleep alone no more. It ate at him, not because he cared about men's jokes, but because he knew how words turn to trouble in a place like this. In the territory, a reputation could kill quicker than a bullet. The women, though, carried on as if the stares had meant nothing. Tallulah filled the cabin with the sound of her soft hums as she cooked or mended clothes, her hands quick with needle and thread when Levi's shirt tore at the shoulder seam. Mika worked outside with restless energy, her strength turning chores that once took Levi a full day into half that time. She drove posts, carried water, stacked wood. Her wariness hadn't vanished, but he noticed how she no longer kept her back to the door every night. Asha remained closest to him, not clinging, but always near, at the corral when he tended the horses, at the table when he made notes in his ledger, her dark eyes steady on him as if measuring every decision he made. Levi wasn't sure if their presence was a burden or a kind of salvation. He had lived years without a voice but his own, and now every hour of the day carried with it the sound of footsteps, laughter, and low words spoken in a tongue he didn't know. Sometimes he caught himself listening longer than he meant to, letting the cadence of their voices settle the silence that used to be his only companion. One evening, after a day mending the corral, Levi sat outside on the porch sharpening a knife. Asha came and stood beside him, her arms folded, her torn dress stitched clumsily at the seam now, but still revealing more than most women in town would dare. She didn't move away when he shifted on the step. She simply looked out across the land, the desert stretching into shadows under the setting sun. "You fear them," she said quietly, her accent thick but clear. Levi glanced at her. "Who?" "Men in town. Their mouths. Their eyes." She didn't blink, didn't soften the words. Levi returned his gaze to the knife. "I don't fear them. I know what they can do." He drew the blade along the whetstone, the scrape loud in the silence. Words turn to fists. Fists turn to guns. Seen it too many times. Asha studied him for a long while, then nodded. "And still you let us stay." Levi paused, setting the knife down. He looked at her directly then, his voice low but firm. "Because turning you away would have been worse than facing all of them put together." For the first time since stepping foot on his land, Asha let a faint smile touch her lips. It wasn't playful, not mocking, but small and real, and it sat in his chest long after she turned to go back inside. The test came sooner than Levi expected. 2 days later, dust rose on the horizon. 2 riders approaching fast, the same ranch hands who had laughed outside the mercantile. Levi recognized them by their slouched hats and the easy way they carried themselves. Men who thought trouble was a game. He felt his stomach tighten as he set down the bucket he had been carrying from the well. Mika was the first to see them. She straightened from where she had been splitting wood, her eyes narrowing. "They come here." Tallulah stepped onto the porch, her hand rising to her mouth. Asha joined Levi at the corral, tall and steady, her gaze locked on the riders. The men reined up at the fence, dust swirling around their boots as they swung down. One, a lean fellow with a scar across his chin, smirked as his eyes raked over the women. "Heard tell Boone was keeping company these days. Thought we'd see if he's sharen't." His laugh was sharp, ugly. The second man spit into the dirt and added, "Reckon you don't need all 3, Boone. Might as well pass 1 or 2 along." Levi's hand moved without thought, resting heavy on the revolver at his hip. His heart hammered, not from fear but from the heat of rage building in his chest. He had spent years keeping his name out of trouble, keeping himself clear of fights. But now the trouble was on his land, and it wasn't just his pride at stake. It was theirs. "You best get back on your horses," Levi said evenly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who would not repeat himself. The scarred one laughed. Or what? You'll shoot us down for talking? He stepped closer to the fence. Ain't no law says. The sound of Levi's revolver clearing leather cut him short. The gun hung steady in Levi's hand, barrel aimed just left of the man's chest. Levi's voice was flat, cold. No law says I got to warn you again, either. The men froze, their bravado faltering as they looked into the eyes of someone who wasn't bluffing. Silence stretched, broken only by the restless snort of Levi's horses in the corral. Finally, the second man muttered, "Ain't worth it." He grabbed his partner's arm, pulling him back. With a curse, the scarred man spat again, but he mounted up. "This ain't the end, Boone," he called as they turned their horses. "You'll pay for thinking you're better than the rest of us." Levi holstered his gun slowly, never looking away until the riders were nothing but dust on the horizon. Only then did he feel the sweat on his neck, the way his chest heaved with the force of keeping steady when his blood wanted him to pull the trigger. Behind him, Asha spoke, her tone calm, but edged with something like approval. "You protect what is yours." Levi turned to her sharply. "You're not mine." For a moment, their eyes locked. She didn't argue. She didn't agree. She only held his gaze until he looked away. Inside, he felt the twist of conflict. He didn't want ownership, didn't want to treat them as possessions. But in that moment, he realized something else. He had chosen to stand for them, and whether he admitted it or not, that made them part of his life now. That night, the cabin was quieter than usual. Tallulah moved about softly, preparing food, her hands careful, as if not wanting to break the stillness. Mika sat near the fire, her arms crossed, her eyes softer than he had ever seen them. She had watched him stand unflinching, and something in her posture told him he had passed a test he didn't know he was taking. Levi lay again on his blanket, the revolver close, the firelight flickering across the beams of the cabin. He told himself he hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted it. But when he remembered the way those men's eyes had slid over the women like they were meat for trade, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He'd put them in the ground before he let anyone take the women from his roof. And for the first time in years, the weight of silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like watchfulness, responsibility, and a faint, unsettling beginning of something that might grow into belonging. By late afternoon, the clouds had rolled in thick and heavy, darker than any Levi had seen in weeks. The air pressed down hot and still, the kind that made men restless before a storm. He had been splitting kindling outside the barn when the first crack of thunder split across the desert. The horses tossed their heads, nervous, and he knew they were in for a long night. "Bring in the water," Levi called, his voice carrying across the yard. Mika moved quick, lifting the bucket from the well with one strong pull, her muscles taut under the weight. Tallulah hurried toward the cabin with an armful of wood, her braids swinging behind her. Asha was already beside Levi, steadying the last of the fence rails as the wind picked up. Her hair whipped across her face, black against the gray sky. She didn't flinch, didn't move back when the thunder cracked again. By the time they made it inside, the rain had started, pelting the roof in hard sheets. The sound filled the cabin, drowning out every other noise. The fire hissed as water dripped down the chimney pipe, but it held. Levi shut the door against the wind and braced his back against it for a moment, breathing hard. The cabin was tighter than ever with 4 bodies inside. The storm seemed to shrink the space, pushing them closer, every movement brushing shoulders, every glance lingering longer than it should. Tallulah busied herself quickly, setting beans on the stove with the last of the onions they had bought in town. Mika sat near the door, her arms folded, her eyes sharp but calm, watching the storm like it was an enemy she meant to keep out. Levi moved to the table, setting his revolver down beside the lantern. He didn't like the way the storm made him feel. It was too much like the nights on cattle drives when men huddled together with nothing but whiskey to push back the dark. He'd left those nights behind for a reason. Asha crossed the room and sat across from him. The lantern between them lit her face, the firelight catching in her eyes. The stitches on her torn dress held, but the fabric still clung close when damp from the rain she had carried inside. She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the table. "You are troubled," she said. Levi's jaw tightened. "Storm makes the horses skittish. Roof leaks. Plenty to be troubled about." She tilted her head, studying him. "Not that." He met her gaze then, steady and unflinching. Inside, though, he felt the weight of her words pressing against the thoughts he didn't want to name. She had seen him draw on men without hesitation. She had seen him take insults without breaking. And now she was telling him she could see through the silence he wore like a coat. Levi cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. "You shouldn't look for more than there is." Asha didn't answer right away. She only reached across the table, her fingers brushing against the back of his hand. It was the smallest touch, but it carried heat stronger than the fire. Levi froze, every muscle in him taut. He should have pulled away, should have kept the distance he had built so carefully. But he didn't. He let her hand rest there, her skin warm against his. The cabin stayed quiet except for the storm hammering the roof. Tallulah's soft humming filled the edges of the silence as she stirred the pot, and Mika shifted now and again by the door, but neither said anything about what was happening at the table. When the beans were ready, they ate together, the storm outside, turning the meal into a kind of shelter in itself. Steam rose from the bowls, the smell rich against the damp air. Levi ate slow, his eyes flicking toward Asha more often than he wanted to admit. Each time, she met his gaze without looking away. After supper, when Tallulah cleared the dishes and Mika stretched out near the fire, Asha stood and crossed to Levi where he sat. She leaned down, close enough that her hair brushed against his shoulder, and spoke low so the others wouldn't hear. "You carry weight alone," she said. "You do not have to." Her words hit harder than any storm. Levi had lived his whole life carrying his own weight, never asking, never sharing. Hearing it said aloud, with her eyes on his, made him feel exposed in a way that rattled him more than gun barrels ever had. He rose, meaning to move past her, but she stepped closer. The lantern light caught the line of her jaw, the softness of her mouth, the strength in her eyes. His breath came short. For a moment, he thought he'd step away. Instead, he reached up, rough fingers brushing against her cheek. Asha didn't pull back. The kiss came slow, unhurried, their mouths meeting in the stillness between thunderclaps. It wasn't wild, wasn't desperate. It was steady like the man he was and the woman she had chosen to be in that moment. When they parted, her forehead rested against his for a long second before she stepped back. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Levi sat again, heart pounding harder than he wanted, his hand still tingling from where it had touched her face. Asha moved to the bed with the others, but her eyes lingered on him until the lantern was turned down low. The storm raged outside long into the night, but inside the cabin, something else had broken open. For the first time in years, Levi Boone lay awake not with loneliness, not with silence, but with the memory of warmth against his lips and the knowledge that the quiet he had built his life on was no longer his alone. The storm broke by morning, leaving the desert washed clean and the air heavy with damp earth. Puddles stood in the low ground, and the smell of wet mesquite drifted through the air. Levi rose stiff from his blanket by the fire, his body weary from a night of half sleep, but his mind sharp with the memory of what had happened. He had kissed Asha. He had felt her lips against his, steady and certain, and though no words had been spoken, the line between them had shifted. The women moved about quietly at first light. Tallulah tended the stove, stirring the beans left from the night before. Mika stepped outside, her boots splashing the mud as she checked the corral fence for damage. Asha lingered near the table, her hair tied back loosely, her eyes following Levi in a way that wasn't hidden. She didn't speak of what had happened, but she didn't need to. Every glance carried it. Levi kept his hands busy, mending the handle of his shovel, checking the lantern wick, doing anything that let him keep his mind from drifting back to that moment. But no matter how hard he tried, it came back anyway. The warmth of her cheek under his hand, the quiet strength in her gaze, the way she had leaned into him without hesitation. He had spent years guarding himself, years building walls high enough that no one could climb them, and in one night she had stepped straight through. He worried about what the others thought. Mika had sharp eyes. She missed nothing. Tallulah's gentleness made her harder to read, but she had glanced at him more than once that morning with something like curiosity, maybe even approval. Levi didn't want them thinking he meant to claim Asha, or worse, that he saw them as women sent for his bed. He had spent his whole life fighting against being the kind of man who took what wasn't freely given. When breakfast was done, Levi stepped outside to saddle his horse. He needed to ride the ridge, check the line fence where the storm might have brought it down. Asha followed him out without asking. "I will go with you," she said simply. Levi shook his head. "Fence work slow. No need." Her eyes narrowed slightly, steady as always. "I go." He considered arguing, but saw it was useless. She was as stubborn as he was. He gave a short nod and tightened the cinch strap. She swung up behind him on the horse with practiced ease, her arms settling lightly around his waist. Levi's body tensed at the contact, but he kept his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. The ride was quiet. The storm had carved gullies into the dry ground, and the fence line sagged where posts had been pulled loose. Levi dismounted, pulling tools from his saddlebag, and set to work. Asha held rails steady as he hammered them back into place. Their hands brushed again and again, neither of them speaking about it, but the silence between them carried a weight that wasn't there before. At midday, they rested by the creek that cut through the ridge. Asha knelt to wash her hands, the water shining against her bronze skin. Levi watched for a moment before looking away, ashamed of how much his eyes wanted to stay on her. "You live alone long time," she said suddenly, her voice calm. Levi nodded. "Too long." He picked up a stone, turning it over in his hand. "Suited me fine. No one to answer to. No one to lose." Asha's gaze lingered on him. "And now?" He didn't answer right away. The truth knotted in his chest. Finally, he said, "Now it's different. Can't pretend it ain't." Her lips curved, not quite a smile, but close. Different is not always bad. They rode back in silence, but the air between them was heavier than before. That evening, when the chores were done and supper eaten, Mika sat by the fire sharpening a hatchet, her eyes flicking toward Levi and Asha more than once. Tallulah mended a torn sleeve, humming softly. The room felt different, charged. Levi sat at the table, cleaning his revolver, while Asha sat across from him, her hands folded neatly, her gaze never wavering. Finally, Mika spoke. "You look at her different." Her voice was blunt, challenging. Levi set the revolver down, meeting her stare. "She's free to stay or go. Same as you." Mika tilted her head, studying him, as if weighing whether his words could be trusted. After a long moment, she gave a short nod and returned to her hatchet. Tallulah's eyes softened. She spoke quiet, almost a whisper. "Maybe it is good. Maybe it is time." Levi said nothing, but inside, her words struck deep. He wondered if they saw more clearly than he did what was happening inside his chest. He had not chosen this life. They had been sent to his door, but now he realized he was choosing every day to let them remain, to protect them, to share the roof over his head. And more than that, he was choosing Asha, whether he admitted it aloud or not. When night fell, the fire burned low, and Levi lay on his blanket once more. He listened to the sound of their breathing, to the soft shift of bodies on the bed. He told himself he was still the same man, the one who lived alone, the one who kept silent and carried his weight without help. But when he closed his eyes, it wasn't silence that filled him. It was the memory of Asha's lips, the sound of her voice telling him he didn't have to carry it all alone, and the truth that he no longer wanted to. The days after the storm carried a strange quiet, as though the desert itself held its breath. Levi Boone went about the chores with the same steady rhythm as always, checking fences, watering stock, hauling feed, but the air around him had changed. Asha moved with him more often than not, steadying posts, passing tools, her silence matching his but carrying weight of its own. Tallulah kept to the cabin, cooking, sewing, humming in her soft voice, while Mika roamed the yard like a sentry, eyes scanning the horizon for trouble, she seemed certain would come. Trouble did not wait long. It began with whispers from town. Levi heard them when he rode in for flour and salt pork. Men paused mid-conversation when he passed. Women pulled their children closer. A ranch hand muttered under his breath, "Not quiet enough." Boone's keeping himself 3 Apache wives. The word carried like smoke, crawling into every corner. Levi ignored it, jaw clenched, but the heat inside him built. He knew too well what such talk could become. Words were never just words. They turned into fists, into knives, into bullets. By the time he loaded his horse and turned toward home, he could feel eyes burning holes in his back. He thought of Asha, Tallulah, Mika waiting at the ranch, and the weight of responsibility pressed heavier than ever. That evening, he said little at the table. The beans Tallulah cooked filled the cabin with their smell, but Levi barely tasted them. Asha studied him in the lantern light, her eyes sharp. "Something is wrong," she said. Levi didn't answer at first. He scraped his spoon across the bottom of his bowl, then set it down. "Talk in town," he said finally. "Men saying things. Ugly things." Mika leaned forward, her arms braced on the table. "They will come." Her voice carried no doubt, only certainty. Tallulah's hands froze around her needle and thread. "What will you do?" she asked softly. Levi looked around the room, at their faces, at the fear and pride both showing there. He thought of the years he had lived alone, answering to no one, and how easy it had been to walk away from men's words. But now it was different. It wasn't just his name they wanted to drag through the dirt. It was theirs. "I'll do what I have to," he said simply. The next day, the riders came. Not 2 this time, but 4, their horses raising dust as they cut across the flat toward the cabin. Levi stepped out onto the porch as soon as he heard them, his revolver already loose in its holster. Asha appeared at his side, tall and unflinching. Mika moved behind the corral fence, her hand gripping the hatchet she had sharpened the night before. Tallulah stayed inside, pulling the curtain just enough to watch. The men reined up 10 yards from the porch. One of them, the scarred ranch hand Levi had faced before, spat into the dirt. "Boone," he called, "you think you're better than the rest of us? Keeping 3 savages under your roof like they're queens." Levi's voice came calm, steady. "Turn your horses. Go back to town." The man laughed, ugly and sharp. "Not till we see what you're hiding. Folks say you're playing house out here. Maybe it's time we had a look." Levi's jaw tightened. His hand hovered near the grip of his revolver. Inside, his heart pounded hard, but his face gave nothing. He had been here before, standing on the edge of violence, and he knew how fast a moment could turn. He felt Asha's presence beside him, her silence strong, her gaze steady on the men. He thought of Mika crouched near the corral, ready to strike, and Tallulah trembling inside. The weight of it pressed heavy. If he faltered, they would all pay for it. "Last chance," Levi said, his voice cutting across the dust-filled air. The ranch hand sneered, spurring his horse a step forward. "Or what? You'll shoot us all down." Levi didn't answer with words. He drew, fast and sure, the revolver steady in his hand. He fired into the dirt at the man's horse's hooves. The animal reared, screaming, nearly throwing its rider. Dust exploded upward, and the silence that followed was sharp as a blade. Levi's gun didn't waver, his eyes cold. "You step on this land again," he said evenly, "you won't get a warning shot." For a moment, no one moved. The 3 other riders shifted uneasy, their hands twitching toward their belts, but not drawing. Finally, the scarred man cursed, jerking his reins. "This ain't finished, Boone," he spat. They wheeled their horses, riding off in a storm of dust. Levi didn't lower his gun until they were gone from sight. Only then did he let out the breath he had been holding. His hands were steady, but inside the fire burned hot. He had drawn a line that couldn't be taken back. Asha turned to him, her face unreadable. "You choose," she said. Levi frowned. "Choose what?" She stepped closer, her eyes locking with his. "To stand with us. To fight for us. That is a choice." Levi's throat tightened. He wanted to argue, to say it wasn't about choice, it was about doing what was right. But the truth settled heavy in his chest. He had chosen. Every time he faced those men, Every time he let the women stay, every time he looked at Asha longer than he should, he had been choosing. That night, the cabin was quiet again, but not with fear. Tallulah moved about calmly, setting bread to rise for the morning. Mika sharpened her hatchet once more, but there was no bitterness in her eyes when she looked at Levi. Asha sat close to him by the table, her shoulder brushing his. No words passed between them, but the silence was no longer a wall. It was a bond. Levi lay on his blanket near the fire, staring at the roof beams. The desert outside was dark and still, but he knew men's anger didn't fade easy. There would be more whispers, maybe more riders. But for the first time, he didn't think about facing it alone. He thought of Asha's eyes, of Tallulah's quiet strength, of Mika's fierce protection. He thought of a household that had become his without him ever asking. And though fear gnawed at him, there was something else there too, a certainty he hadn't felt in years. He would stand, and they would stand with him. The days that followed the confrontation weighed heavy on Levi Boone's mind. He worked the land the way he always had, steady and deliberate, but every time the wind carried dust across the horizon, his eyes lifted, waiting for riders. The threat of those men lingered like a shadow, and though they had ridden off with curses, he knew their pride wouldn't let the matter rest. Inside the cabin, life carried on. Tallulah baked bread from the last of the flour, her soft humming filling the small space, her hands sure as she shaped dough. Mika split wood each morning, her hatchet rising and falling with practiced rhythm, though her eyes never strayed far from the open land. Asha stayed closest to Levi, working beside him at the corral, handing him nails, her shoulder brushing his arm as though reminding him she was there. The bond between them had grown stronger since the storm, unspoken but undeniable. One afternoon, word came from town. A trader who passed by stopped for water at Levi's well and carried news in his casual way. Heard those ranch hands got themselves drunk again. Sheriff's keeping an eye. Says they won't risk pushing Boone no more. Reckon you made your point. He said it with a half smile, tipped his hat, and rode on. Levi stood silent a long while after the trader left, the bucket rope dangling in his hand. Relief pressed through him, but so did something heavier. He realized then that the danger hadn't just been about guns and fists. It had been about whether he could protect what had come into his life without asking. He knew now that he could, and that he would, no matter who tried to take it from him. That evening, as the sun set red over the desert, Levi sat on the porch sharpening his knife. Asha came and stood beside him, her presence filling the space without a word. After a long silence, she spoke. You stood for us. Again and again. Levi's eyes stayed on the blade. Didn't have much choice. Asha tilted her head, studying him. You had choice. Always. Levi set the knife down and looked at her. The lantern light caught her face, her dark eyes steady, her hair falling loose over her shoulders. He thought of the first time he saw her at his door, tall and proud in her torn dress, uncertain yet unyielding. He thought of the storm, the kiss, the way she had reached for his hand without fear. And he thought of the silence he had lived in before her, the years of empty nights. I didn't want anyone here, he admitted, his voice rough. Thought I'd die alone, thought that was easier. But then you came. You all came. And now, he stopped, his throat tightening. Now I don't want you to leave. Asha's expression softened, the faintest curve touching her lips. Then I stay. Not because I was sent, because I choose. The words settled into him like stone, steady and sure. He reached for her hand, his rough fingers curling around hers. She didn't pull away. Inside, Tallulah watched from the stove, her eyes warm. Mika leaned against the wall, arms folded, a small smirk tugging at her mouth. Neither spoke, but their silence was its own kind of acceptance. That night, the cabin was different. The fire burned steady, the air warm not just from the wood but from the sense of belonging that filled the space. For the first time, Levi took his place not on the blanket by the fire but at the bed. He lay beside Asha, not in secrecy, not in shame, but in certainty. Mika and Tallulah settled near, unguarded now, no longer strangers in his home, but part of it. The next morning, the desert stretched wide and open, the sun rising clean over the horizon. Levi stepped outside with Asha at his side, the air cool, the land alive with the smell of damp earth after the storm. He looked out across the ridge, at the corral, the cabin, the life he had built, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The whispers in town no longer mattered. The threats no longer mattered. What mattered was here. 3 women who had walked to his door, carrying nothing but their pride, and a man who had thought he was destined for silence until they chose to stay. Levi Boone had not asked for family, but he had one now, and he would hold it, protect it, and live it until his last breath. The story ended there, not with doubt or distance, but with certainty, the quiet, unshakable truth of a man and woman who had chosen each other, and a household bound not by obligation but by choice.